All right, welcome to our Thursday night New York Giants Preservation Society meeting for today, April 11th, 2024, with Andrew Goldblatt. Andrew will be talking about a book he wrote a while back called The Giants and the Dodgers, 4 Cities, 2 Teams, 1 Rivalry. And we know the I guess, hatred for the Dodgers in this group, so Andrew will be talking about his book and all that goes with it. In the next few weeks. Next week, we have Steve Steinberg will be discussing his new book out on Mike Dolan. When I send out the information, either tonight or tomorrow on the next meeting, if you want to buy his book, there's a 40% discount code you could use on that. So if that book might interest you, that might be a great way to buy it. On 4/24, we have a brand new book by Jerry Grillo on Johnny Mize. And then the next day, 4/25, there's no meeting because we're having it on Wednesday. But I'm going to invite whoever wants to come on here to do a 1 or 2 sentence birthday wish to Willie Mays. Willie's assistant, Renee, I've been in contact with her. She's just a lovely lady. We will make this birthday card, Zoom or whatever. It's not going to be the 3-hour job we did, about 2424. It'll just be, hey, Willie, happy birthday, blah, blah, blah. And then Renee, I will send it to her and she will play it for Willie. And I think that'd be a nice thing. Whoever shows up, will get their opportunity to talk. If you're not interested in doing that, it's no sweat, okay? What else could I tell you? And then following that meeting, when we get into May, it'll be May, the month of May. There's going to be 4 Zooms that month. They're all dedicated to Willie Mays. So without any further ado, I would love to introduce to you Andrew Goldblatt. Andrew, welcome to the New York Giants Preservation Society, and thank you so much for joining us. Give it up for Andrew.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gary. I wanted to maybe say before anything else to the rest of the group, if you don't know how Gary acts behind the scenes, when he called me, it was completely out of the blue, and I was totally surprised. I hadn't done anything around this book for years. I think in 2016, I did a segment with Marty Lurie, who I think you've had recently. And then in October of 2017, a reporter for the New York Times gave me a call. You might recall that 2017 was a terrible year for the Giants. And he was a Giant fan. And he called me to inquire whether it was permissible to root for the Dodgers because they were going into the playoffs that year. And we're all Californians, right? So isn't that okay? And I didn't give him his expiation. And then he just asked me what I thought the state of the rivalry was more recently since I had written my book. And I had to say that I did think that the intensity of it had gone down a fair amount over the years, and it was kind of sad, but nonetheless got myself in the New York Times with a quote, so I felt pretty good about that. But nothing since then until Gary's phone call. And first thing I said to Gary is, you realize that this book is 20 years old, right? And Gary said, yeah, that's okay, no problem. And I said, and you realize that the neurons that I had devoted to researching and writing this book have either been reassigned or died in the last 20 years. And Gary said, yeah, that's okay, don't worry about it. And he was persistent enough that I really felt like I had no choice but to go ahead and do this. So here I am. And the next thing I asked Gary was, well, how do I prepare? What is it that you need me to do? And he said, well, we have all of these calls on Zoom, so you can just go into YouTube and check them out, and you'll get the idea from that. And so I did, which is how I know that you've spoken to Marty Lurie recently. But I also found out that you guys are pretty hardcore. I mean, there is not going to be much that I feel like I can tell you that you don't already know. But when I thought about what I could possibly do to kind of make myself worthy of this group for an hour, I realized that, well, we're all roughly about the same age, which means that we all kind of came to baseball consciousness in the 50s and 60s. So I thought, there was kind of a prelude to those years, which in my opinion are the best years of the rivalry. And so maybe I should talk to you about that, because maybe you were born, but the odds are that you weren't really fully baseball woke at that point. And so maybe I thought I could contextualize where things were going in the mid to late 40s, before all of you saw your first game, realized you loved the Giants, hated the Dodgers, and all that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read that section from my book. And of course, the book is about the Giants and the Dodgers. So half of this section is written about the Dodgers. And I'll compress that to a very short summary, which is the first thing that happened with the Dodgers during this period, obviously, was Jackie Robinson's arrival, which is, it's the anniversary of that is going to happen in 4 days, I think. And of course, that was very important, nationally important, culturally important. But I think in the time that's been since then, we've all celebrated and come to realize how fantastic it is. I don't think we realized how much difficulty that caused within the Dodger organization. So that was one issue that was roiling the Dodgers at the time. And then the other big issue that was roiling the Dodgers at this time was the competition between Walter O'Malley and Branch Rickey for control of the team. And one of the principal pawns in this battle between the two of them was the manager of the Dodgers, who Rickey had known since his days with the St. Louis Cardinals, and that, of course, is Leo Durocher. And so you may recall that in 1947, Durocher was suspended by Happy Chandler, the commissioner of baseball, for actions detrimental to baseball. And some of this got religious. I mean, we all know about the gambling aspect of it. But one of the things a lot of people have forgotten is that Durocher in the winter of 1946 married the actress Lorraine Day. And Lorraine Day had not yet divorced her husband. I mean, she was in the process of divorcing him, but the papers hadn't been finalized. And back in those chaster times, that was a scandal of the first order. And the Catholic youth organization in Brooklyn was so scandalized that they withdrew 100,000 of their kids from the Knothole gang. And because O'Malley was a conservative Catholic, he was able to kind of hold this over the head of Rickey, who was a conservative Protestant. Because again, it may kind of seem quaint now, given what we argue over, but back in those days, those were big differences, and they were considerable cultural differences. So that's where the Dodgers were. And I'll read a couple of paragraphs just to close up on that, and then we'll get to the Giants. So Chandler's draconian edict reflected badly on Rickey, Durocher's patron and protector. Dodger co-owner Walter O'Malley was quick to exploit the embarrassment. The Bronx-born plutocratic O'Malley was a bankruptcy attorney hired by the Brooklyn Trust Company to watch its investment in the Dodgers. Much as Charles Ebbets worked his way to the top as Charles Burns' right-hand man, so O'Malley gained influence by catering to the whims of the Brooklyn Trust's George V. McLaughlin. With McLaughlin's blessing, in 1944, he joined as an equal partner with Rickey and John Smith, head of the Pfizer Company, in the purchase of half the McKeever estate's Dodger holdings. A year later, the Ebbets estate put all of its stock up for sale, and the threesome bought that too. Collectively, they became majority owners. But in reality, Rickey owned 25%, Smith owned 25%, and O'Malley owned 25%. The remaining 25% was owned by Dearie Mulvey, the daughter of Steve McKeever. Smith was the fulcrum. He threw his support behind fellow pious Protestant Ricky. O'Malley, who considered Ricky a psalm-singing fake, wasn't willing to settle for a silent partnership. As a prominent member of Brooklyn's conservative Catholic establishment, he could have quelled the ecclesiastical condemnations of DeRocher, but he preferred that Ricky squirm. The strategy paid off. For John Smith, the DeRocher scandals were too much. He switched allegiance to O'Malley, and after he died in July 1950, his wife gave O'Malley control of his stock. O'Malley used the leverage to oust Ricky less than 4 months later. Over the next few years, O'Malley sedulously purged the Dodger organization of Ricky loyalists. Anyone who uttered Ricky's name was fined $1. So, where were the Giants while all this was going on? Leo DeRocher had the ultimate answer. He was sitting in the visitors' dugout at the Polo Grounds before a game on July 5th, 1946, shooting the bull with Red Barber and reporters Frank Graham and Milton Richmond. Accounts differ as to how he got on the topic. According to DeRocher himself, he was explaining why he liked Eddie Stanky so much. He can't do a goddamn thing but beat you. Sure, they call him a brat and the Mobile Muskrat and all that. Take a look at that number 4 out there, Mellott. A nicer guy never drew breath than that man there. Walker Cooper, Mize, Marshall, Kerr, Gordon, Thompson, take a look at them. All nice guys. They'll finish last. Nice guys, finish last. In Graham's version, Barber was teasing DeRocher about all the home runs the Giants hit against the Dodgers in a doubleheader the day before. DeRocher snorted that the homers were cheap shots, Polo Grounds specials to the corners. Why don't you admit they were real home runs? Why don't you be a nice guy for a change? Barber persisted. Nice guys, DeRocher spat. Look over there. You know a nicer guy than Mellott or any of the other Giants? Well, they're the nicest guys in the world. And where are they? In last place. According to Richmond, DeRocher was complaining about fair-weather friends. Barber urged him to be a nice guy and take a more forgiving view of human nature. Nice guy, responded DeRocher. Being a nice guy gets you nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. Look over there, he said, pointing to Ott. There's one of the nicest guys in the world. Is it doing him any good? He's in last place. That's where nice guys finish. Last. Whichever version you choose, 2 things are clear. DeRocher meant no offense, and Ott took none. And he never literally said nice guys finish last, one of baseball's most famous contributions to American parlance. The epigram was the invention of headline writers the next day. And though DeRocher acknowledged that he never said such a thing, he never hesitated to exploit it either, using it for the title of his autobiography. Ott's Giants did finish last that year. The next year, 1947, they delighted owner Horace Stoneham by setting a record for homers with 221. But they improved only to 4th place, 13 games behind the pennant-winning Dodgers, who even with sleepy Burt Shotton standing in for DeRocher, played heads-up ball, leading the league in walks and stolen bases. After 6 seasons spent mostly in the 2nd division, it became clear to Stoneham that Ott couldn't handle pitchers. The Giants never had an ERA below the league average during Ott's tenure. But Stoneham loved Ott, and so did his fans. So when the 1948 season rolled around, Master Melvin was still in charge. The Giants started strongly that year, but they couldn't sustain the momentum. By the All-Star break, Stoneham decided once and for all to make a move. He came up with a radical, some would say insane idea, hiring Burt Shotton, idled by DeRocher's reinstatement. To avoid any hint of tampering, he asked National League President Ford Frick to set up a meeting with Branch Rickey at Frick's Manhattan office. The meeting took place the afternoon of July 15th. When Stoneham asked permission to speak to Schotten, Rickey came back with a shocker. No, I may need him at any moment myself. Swallowing his surprise, the Giant owner asked if that meant DeRocher would soon be available. DeRocher had been under tremendous pressure since his return. Scandalmongers scrutinized his every move. Fans and pundits agreed that if Schotten, who got lost going to the Polo Grounds, could win a pennant with the Dodgers, DeRocher ought to conquer the universe with them. Meanwhile, Rickey wanted Jackie Robinson moved to his best position, second base, and traded Eddie Stanky to do it, depriving DeRocher of his favorite player and creating a hole at first base. And Robinson, after a winter on the banquet circuit, reported to spring training 20 pounds overweight. Though more caustic than usual, DeRocher kept his nose and everything else clean. And in a moment of serendipity, he had catcher Gil Hodges try on a first baseman's mitt. But the Dodgers got off to a bad start. Attendance fell, and O'Malley, supported by Smith, leaned heavily on Rickey to get rid of his prodigal son. On July 4th, after DeRocher was ejected from a wild game in which the Dodgers beat the Giants 13-12, Rickey sent an intermediary to the clubhouse to request DeRocher's resignation. DeRocher refused, correctly surmising that Rickey didn't have the heart to fire him outright. Stoneham hadn't known any of this, of course, but he had long admired DeRocher. His Giants had an unsightly 69-118 record against the Dodgers, against DeRocher's Dodgers, and he leaped at the chance to get him. Rickey recalled DeRocher from Montreal, where he was scouting Brooklyn's top farm team for pitching help. They met in Rickey's office that night. Rickey revealed Stoneham's interest. Unsure where he stood, DeRocher asked, "Am I the manager of this ball club now?" "Yes," Rickey answered, confirming that DeRocher hadn't been fired. "Will I be the manager of this ball club tomorrow? Next week? Next month? Until the close of the 48th season?" That one Rickey couldn't answer. Loyal as he was to Rickey and Brooklyn, DeRocher placed a higher value on survival. He called Stoneham, and they arranged to meet at DeRocher's apartment on Manhattan's East Side. Before DeRocher could get there, Stoneham arrived with Carl Hubbell. Lorraine Day, a teetotaling Mormon, turned off the Dodger broadcast she was listening to and fixed them drinks. The announcement of DeRocher's switch from the Dodgers to the Giants was made the next morning. At first, there was dead calm. Then a gathering realization that something huge and irrevocable had occurred. And finally, a tremendous, at times melodramatic outpouring of emotion. The only word to describe their reaction is dumbfounded, wrote the New York Herald Tribune's Al Laney about the Giants, who were preparing for a game against the Pirates when the announcement was made. By the time DeRocher arrived in Pittsburgh, the press corps was shaking off its dismay. "I love Mel Ott, and I'll tell you right now, I'm going to kick your brains out," the New York Mirror's Kenny Smith promised him. And the Giants returned home to the Polo Grounds to find the fans' attitude hardened. "It took them 2 years to learn to barely tolerate me," said DeRocher. In Brooklyn, the reaction was mixed. Jackie Robinson had developed a searing enmity for DeRocher due to the harsh methods DeRocher used to get him in shape. "I sure do like to play for that man," he said of Schotten. "I can hardly wait." But Roy Campanella, a rookie in 1948, missed DeRocher. "I thought Leo was a tremendous manager. I never had a bad word for Leo because he lived and died with me. Though some fans were glad to see DeRocher go, most venerated him as the leader who turned the Dodgers from laughingstocks to terrors. That cheapskate Ricky's given a pennant to the Giants, growls the bartender at the left field bar and grill. Another DeRocher supporter called the Herald Tribune to confirm the news, then said, "Okay, send a photographer down to the Brooklyn Bridge in 20 minutes. I'm jumping off." 10 days later, the Giants played a single game in Brooklyn. Tonight's Dodger-Giant game needs only the appearance of Memphis Bill Terry as Brooklyn manager to complete the sense of unreality, mused the Eagles' Tommy Holmes. Fans were lining up for bleacher seats by 10:30 in the morning, and Ebbets Field was sold out 2 hours before game time. The Eagle estimated nearly 15,000 fans were turned away. Years later, DeRocher claimed that the whole park stood up and booed me when he first came on the field. But the game account by the Eagles' Harold C. Burr contradicted him. All Brooklyn was still a trifle stunned and wounded to the quick to see their beloved Lippy wearing the uniform of the hated enemy, the feared John McGraw and the despised Bill Terry. But they viewed the sight more in sorrow than in anger. Whatever emotions fans might have vented at the start, they were silent from the cry of play ball as DeRocher's Giants scored 5 first-inning runs and cakewalked to a 13-4 victory. Leo DeRocher proved one thing in 1948. For all his personal failings, he was a managerial genius. Running the Dodgers, he beat the Giants 8 times in 12 tries. Then he took over the Giants and beat the Dodgers 7 out of 10. The team split the season series. With him as the catalyst, the next 7 years of the rivalry were filled with beanballs, taunts, arguments, beanballs, spikings, collisions, beanballs, fights, and retaliations. Oh, and did we mention beanballs? Whenever the Giants played the Dodgers, DeRocher's advice to his pitchers, shouted from the dugout so everyone could hear, was stick it in his ear. One hurler in particular, the glowering Sal Magley, took the words to heart and became the most hated man in Brooklyn. When I was pitching for the New York Giants in the early 1950s, he recalled, my friends used to warn me never to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge. If I ever set foot in Flatbush, they told me I'd be committing suicide. After DeRocher left the Giants in 1955, and Magley, in the second most startling uniform switch of the era, became a Dodger, a lot of spirit went out of the rivalry. And then parenthetically, Jackie Robinson was traded to New York in December 1956, but had already decided to retire and never wore the black and orange. That slackening passion made it easier for Horace Stoneham and Walter O'Malley to instigate a change far more devastating to Giant and Dodger fans than the Lips' overnight defection. Thank you.
Andrew, that was great. I failed to show everybody. This is still available on Amazon. Great cover.
Thank you.
I'm sorry?
Oh, no, thank you for the cover.
Love the cover, and I love the title. I'm going to start with a couple of questions. Andrew, a lot of the guys in here, most of them are also San Francisco Giant fans. Which angle did you prefer to write about, the New York, Brooklyn, or the LA, San Francisco?
Well, both, actually, because so I should full disclosure here. My parents are from Brooklyn. My dad was not a huge Dodger fan. He was more into basketball. But nonetheless, they were from Brooklyn. And my father was a very tall, very skinny Jewish man from Brooklyn. And so when the Dodgers picked up a pitcher who very much looked a lot like him, he really paid attention to the Dodgers. In fact, my very first memory of seeing any kind of baseball with my dad was 1965 when I grew up a Met fan because I was born just before the Dodgers and Giants moved and never had a chance to really get to know them as New York teams. So I was a Met fan, and Sandy Koufax had never been defeated by the Mets at that point. And then all of a sudden, he got into a game with Tug McGraw, and the Mets started scoring runs on Koufax. And my dad had come home late from work, and he had dinner with my mom. And then finally he came down, to watch the TV with me. And it was already like the 6th or 7th inning, and the Mets were beating Sandy Koufax. And I will just never forget the look on my dad's face, that sense of like, oh my God, my God is vincible, he can be defeated. And he walked away, kind of, sad. And it was really befuddling to me because I had never seen anything like that before. It was sort of my first experience with the disappointment of fandom. And I realized, wow, my dad's not only not into baseball, but now he's really not into baseball after Sandy Koufax got beat by the Mets. But he had noticed that I was a burgeoning fan. And after the Dodgers were in town, of course, the Giants came in after them. And although my dad didn't want to see a game, I had friends who were going, and my dad managed to arrange for me to go with the friends just to take me to the game. And that was my first Major League Baseball game, was to see the Mets against the Giants at Chase Stadium. So, there were roots for me in the old rivalry, and I was very interested in it. But like the two teams, I moved out to the Bay Area, and over the years, I shed my Met fandom and became a Giant fan, and it's been that way ever since. But it's always been easy for me to be fair and sympathetic to the Dodgers just because of my parents' background.
Thank you so much. My other question is, what made you write this? Was it your parents' upbringing that you were in New York? Or, the topic is great. The title is great. What made you delve into this?
So it was a very happy accident. I was kind of in a very bad position employment-wise in the late 1990s. And I was trying to get editors' jobs, and I wasn't getting them. And so I was part of an organization that allowed, they had all these informational interviews. And that was one of the things that they specialized in. And when it came to editorially, the editorial profession, they had someone who was willing to provide informational interviews by the name of John Berger, who was a developmental editor from San Francisco. And so I called him up, and he agreed to meet me. And we started talking about being an editor. And he said, well, of course you're not getting editorial jobs, you're a writer. And writers are way too opinionated about right and wrong in words to ever be editors. So I thought, okay, thanks for thwarting my ambition, et cetera, et cetera. But we just kept talking. And he mentioned that he was quite a baseball fan, that he was a huge Giants fan. And I said, go on. And he said, well, the Giants are starting, they're opening their new stadium next year. It was 1999, so it would have been 2000. And he said, I've been trying to sell them on the concept of a souvenir book for all the fans who come to opening day, which would be a history of the rivalry between the Giants and the Dodgers. He said, so far the Giants have been kind of cool to the idea, but I have been looking around for someone who would write that if I actually got the project. And I thought, me. And so he asked me to send him a writing sample, and I did. And he loved it. And so he had me on board as his writer if the Giants ever agreed to that project. Well, of course they didn't. But nonetheless, the idea had been planted at that point. John was a native San Franciscan. He lived out in the western part of San Francisco, not too far from where Orlando Cepeda had a house. And he had vivid memories of getting on his bicycle with his friends and heading toward Orlando's house to see if maybe they could see him. So he had really, he was very deeply invested in the whole rivalry and the Giants, and he passed away sadly about 8 years ago. But this was the best editorial experience I've ever had. And I think part of it was just that he was very flexible. He was always able to he dealt with the Giants for me, he dealt with the Dodgers, he dealt with everybody. So that it made it very easy for me to just write. So it was a match made in heaven, a very lucky break for me.
Good for you. Congratulations on that. We're
Thank
going to
you.
open it up now. Paul, you're first. Unmute, Paul. Paul, are you there, Paul?
Got it. There,
you go,
sorry.
Paul. Go ahead.
Difficulty. I have just a question. They're related. In your opinion, who was the most hated by the New York Giants? And then second, who is the most hated Dodger by the San Francisco Giants?
So I think probably by the Giants players or by sort of the San Francisco players?
It's players, yeah.
Okay, I think it's hard to know. The only player I interviewed at any length over this was actually Lou Johnson of the Dodgers. And that was mostly about the whole 1965 thing. So my guess is that probably Marshall is on that list for the Dodger fans who hated Giants. As far as Giant fans who hated Dodgers, I can think of Garvey, I think, was probably pretty high on the list. Because I think everybody kind of knew he was fake. That whole all-American boy image was kind of a front, and that he was kind of a empty suit in a lot of ways. Going back to the New York era, for the first 40 years of the 20th century, I don't think that the Giants worried too much about the Dodgers because they tended to be a much better team.
Right.
There was a lot of bad blood between McGraw and Wilbert Robinson, the manager of the Dodgers, particularly in the 19-teens after Robinson and McGraw got into a huge argument. At that point, Robinson left the Giants and the Dodgers hired him as their manager. And then Robinson won pennants with them in 1916 and 1924. So I think that probably McGraw instilled a lot of hatred toward Wilbert Robinson during that era. I mean, those are the guys on the cover of the book. And you can kind of tell just by the way they're standing that there's a bit of unease between them. And I think they never quite got over that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Mars, you're up.
Thank you, Andrew, for joining us. So, of course, Wilbert Robertson and John McGraw were teammates on the Baltimore Orioles of the National League. So why did this how did these differences start?
So, yeah, I mean, they were more than just teammates. They also were in business together. They had a combined sort of saloon, pool hall, just sort of overall a hangout place called the Diamond Cafe when they were both with the Baltimore Orioles. And they actually made more money from that enterprise than they did from playing baseball. And it actually empowered both of them. There's a great story about how when the Orioles dissolved, Ned Hanlon traded them to St. Louis. And they didn't want to report, they didn't want to go to St. Louis because it was worth more to them to stay in Baltimore and make money from the cafe. So they got tremendous terms from St. Louis. In fact, McGraw, I think, got a rescission of the reserve clause written into his contract with St. Louis. And he didn't last there very long because they didn't like it and they left. But after a few years of managing the Giants by himself, after the highlights of like 06 and 08 and all of that, the Giants started to flail a little bit. And of course, one person you might remember that McGraw brought in was Rube Marquardt, hoping to turn around the pitching staff, who quickly became known as the $11,000 Lemon. and he was just having trouble with his pitching staff. And so he called up his old catching friend and he said, you know, why don't you come in for spring training and work with my pitchers and see what you can get them to do? Well, Robinson was a very, very nice guy. I mean, he was the opposite temperamentally of McGraw, and the pitchers took to him immediately. They loved his advice, and the Giants turned it around. I mean, they had really good years in 1911 and 12 and 13. And a lot of them credited Wilbert Robinson for that change. Well, that did not sit well with McGraw. And to this day, nobody knows exactly what touched off the feud between them. But the suspicion is that the fact that Robinson was more popular with some of the players and was getting some credit for putting the Giants back on top led to a sense of jealousy in McGraw that he just couldn't forgive. And somebody said something that they couldn't take back, and that was that.
Well, here's another question that kind of like escalates from the Robinson McGraw feud. Bill Terry made a statement in spring training of 1932 when sports writers asked him about Brooklyn, and he said, "Are they still in the league?" I think that was actually in the spring of it was
It's
in the
34.
spring of 34,
Yeah.
and the Dodgers played the Giants in the last series and upset them, knocking the Giants out. So my question is, it must have been the rivalry even before that, even when the Dodgers were second division clubs. In your research, did you find that it was more of a bitter rivalry in New York or on the West Coast?
Well, first let me just talk about that 1934 thing. And actually, so because it will foreshadow what I'm going to talk about with the West Coast rivalry. What I found in the course of my research is that one of the reasons that the era between, say, 1947 and 1971 was the best for the rivalry was because both teams were good. But for most of the rivalry, one team was good and one team was not so good. And for the first 40 years of the 20th century, the Dodgers were not so good and the Giants were pretty good. And what happened was the fans of the underdog tended to carry the rivalry. So in the early part of the 20th century, it was Dodger fans who were much more passionate about the rivalry. Giant fans felt it, but they didn't have that same passion. It was, the Dodgers could finish last, but if they beat the Giants or battled the Giants even, it was a decent season for them, for the fans. So move that to the West Coast, and now move that to past, say, 1971, when Stone was in bad shape financially. He was starting to sell away his best players. He let Willie Mays go. I mean, the franchise was in really bad shape. And meanwhile, the Dodgers are getting better. The Dodgers, turned into contenders on the level of Cincinnati. And they brought in Lasorda, who was a firebrand and an antagonist. And so at that point, the Giant fans became much more passionate about the rivalry than Dodger fans were. In fact, Lasorda would almost intentionally say, "Oh, we're not worried about the Giants. We're worried about Cincinnati. They're our rivals." But Giant fans, of course, felt that if we beat the Dodgers, it's been a good year no matter how we finish.
I think you hit it right on the head, because when the Giants were playing poorly, going to Candlestick, what we had to look for is to tease Tommy Lasorda, who would flip the fans the bird. We had nothing else going for us. They were beating us every year. We weren't even competitive, So it's almost like the reverse. For the first 40 years, the Dodgers they've only won in 1916 or 1920. Other
Right.
than that, and they didn't win a World Series.
Yep, that's
And
right.
so I think they finally got their comeback.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, and if you remember the last game at Candlestick Park, where they brought Lasorda out just to make that ceremonial last walk, from the right field, where the visiting team would come in actually from a door in right field. And they made him take that one last ceremonial walk, and he waved his hat, and the fans just booed him mercilessly. And it almost like reminded me of like 1984 and the 2 Minutes Hate, where everybody hated Goldstein, and except that it was all in fun. It was this huge joke between everybody. And actually, that's like one of the concluding um, um, episodes that I write about in the book, because it really encapsulated the rivalry. Was Lasorda egging on the fans and the fans going right at him, and everybody is having fun out of it.
I was at that game. They gave away a pin, and I was sitting behind the Dodgers dugout, and all the fans along were chanting lean cuisine, because he was advertising for that food
Oh,
product,
that's right. Yeah.
and yet he didn't look very lean.
No, he did not. No.
Thank you,
Mars.
Andrew.
I'm sure Norm was there booing also. So anyway, Harvey, you are up.
Andrew, thanks for joining us. This is a wonderful topic which never leaves Giants fans. I got two brief stories, two brief ones. In 1995, my wife and I met for the first time Bobby Thompson.
Mhm.
My wife grew up in Brooklyn as an avid Dodgers fan. She later became an avid Mets fan. So we're walking into this banquet hall. Bobby towered over us, and Helen was on his right and I was on his left. And Helen couldn't resist. She said, "I have to tell you, Bobby, I grew up a Dodgers fan." And Bobby looks at her and says, "That's all right, dear. My father was a Dodgers fan." And then he turned to me without breaking stride and said, "Until I signed with the Giants." The second story, very briefly, I will tell you, was around 1981. I was at Yankee Stadium. It was a playoff game. And one of my dear friends was working for the Yankees in security in their executive VIP area. And I went back during one of the in-between innings breaks, and I was wearing this hat, the black and orange New York Giants hat, because that's what I do. And I walked into this room with this big Yankee logo, this big NY Yankee logo. And there was just two people in the room, me and Pee Wee Reese.
Wow.
Pee Wee was there. He was working for Louisville Slugger. He had a bag of bats. He looked in great shape, tanned. And I'm walking, I recognized him right away. And he's looking at my hat. I could see his eyes looking at the Giants logo. And I introduced myself. And I said, I couldn't think of what to say. So I made this idiot comment. I said, "Hope you're not offended." He says, "Not at all. How long has it been?" And I couldn't do the arithmetic. It was around 1981. Giants left in 57. Dodgers left in 57. We had a conversation in which Pee Wee Reese said that he had been in the Yankee dugout before the game. And he was talking to Yogi Berra, and they were talking about how many World Series they had won. And of course, the Brooklyn Dodgers had won only one. And the Yankees had won a disgusting number of that I don't know. They're up to 28 now. Who the hell knows? They're 27. And Pee Wee Reese did an imitation of Yogi Berra. And it was perfect. And I was mesmerized. So then this whole conversation takes about 7 or 8, 9 minutes, maybe 10. I don't want it to end. We're still the only two in the room. My friend hasn't come back, and I don't care. And so I say to him, "Pee Wee, who do you think's going to win this series?" The Yankees, as I recall, were playing the A's. This was a strike year. And he reaches out to me as if to get closer. Remember, there were the only two in the room. He lowers his voice and he says, "I hate to say this, but the Yankees." And what he was conjuring up, at least in my thought process, was the 50s, when, even though I hated the Dodgers, I detest the Los Angeles Dodgers. There's a difference between hatred and detestation. I can't stand the Los Angeles Dodgers. I've mellowed about my memory about the Brooklyn Dodgers. But what Pee Wee Reese was doing was he was hearkening back to a time when there were 16 teams. And when the World Series came about, National League fans banded together to root against the hated Yankees, even though I hated the Dodgers. So it's a wonderful topic that you have brought to us this evening. Thank you very much. And I guess if I have one more question, what is your the Bobby Thompson home run, arguably the greatest moment in baseball, at least for us Giants fans. Where does that fit in your discussion?
No, front and center. There's a whole chapter devoted to the 1951 pennant race. And one of the funnest things I got to do was to transcribe the Hodges call of the home run shot and try to figure out what kind of orthography, how do I spell out that shout that he does at the end? And that was one of the fun things I got to do with my editors. Like, how do exactly we reproduce the sound of that shout from Russ Hodges at the end of his call?
Yeah.
But you know,
Yeah.
it was the other thing though that was really interesting about doing the 51 season is that this was about a year or so after the revelation had come out that the Giants were sign stealing. And so I actually got to talk to the guy who broke that story. And we had a nice conversation about it. And I actually went back and did some statistical analysis. And again, you know, correlation is not causation, so I'm not going to make any claims or anything. But it was very interesting to me that after the alleged date when the Giants started doing the sign stealing, the player who did the best between the time before that and afterwards was Bobby Thompson.
Well, if I can, I spoke to Bobby Thompson around 2002 when those articles first started coming out in the Wall Street Journal. And we were in literally in his kitchen in Watchung, New Jersey. And he raised the subject. He raised the subject to me. I was with my friend Bill Murphy, who was then district attorney of Staten Island and a very close friend of Bobby's. They were golfing buddies. And Bobby said to me, what did I think of those articles about the sign stealing? And I was about to give him my ultimate fans saying, you know, that I don't believe him. Bobby interrupted me and he said, you know, it was legal. And I stopped breathing at that. I literally stopped breathing at that point. I thought he was about to tell me. He then explained to me that he did not get the sign. He knew there was sign gathering. I don't even want to use the word stealing, but he didn't trust. He wanted to get the pitch the natural way because he had no faith in Sal Evars, who was supposedly relaying the signs. And if Evars said it was a curveball coming and it was really a fastball and Bobby leaned in, he'd get it in the head. So I had the conversation. Gary, I can't remember who wrote the book, The Echoing Green.
Josh Prager.
Yeah, Joshua Ayers Prager, that's right.
Right, a nice guy. And Gary made sure I sat next to him at one of our dinners, and I was nasty, I think, and telling him maybe there was a spyglass in center field, but Whitey Lockman was on second base. You didn't need a spyglass from 600 feet away to steal a sign when you had Whitey Lockman on second base, and you had the brilliant Dodger infield, and the team that was smart, and they were going to change the signs. Bobby didn't get that sign. I believe Bobby 100%, and I believe him. That's the direct testimony and the circumstances of Lockman on second base, the great Dodger infield. They were not going to allow that sign stealing. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
That you are. Bill Clank, you are up.
Thank you very much, Gary. And before I give kudos here to Andrew, Harvey, you made a point which is so strong. I've noticed something about Gary and the people that are invited here. Certainly, many tell Giant stories. Many tell Dodger stories. We don't get many Yankee stories, and I don't think we will be getting many. So I think we're pretty much behind on that. Andrew, I want to tell you, I'm like I think like most of us here, I don't know a lot. Now I know a lot more about what went on in the mid to late 40s between the Giants and Dodgers. I did not really understand what the dynamics were between O'Malley and Rickey, and now I do, and I know who the players are. I don't deal in hypotheticals. I ask straight up questions, but I'm going to give you a hypothetical. If in 1946, somehow Smith and the Brooklyn Trust had been able to wrest control of the Dodgers away from Rickey and it went to O'Malley, would he have extended a contract to Robinson? And if he didn't, and then I'll give you my opinion on who too, when you're done, who would have?
Bill, you muted yourself. Bill, you muted yourself. Bill.
I'm no longer muted. That was my wife acting there, I think. No, seriously. Who do you think? I think you missed this part. Who do you think would have? I have an opinion. It was a Hall of Famer. I'll give you a hint. It's right there.
Yeah, and I think I got your hint. I will say, just for the record, I don't think it would have been Stoneham.
No.
There was a meeting in, I think, either very late 1946 or early 1947 of the National League owners. And they knew that Jackie Robinson was coming, and they took a vote on it. And they spoke, of course, beforehand and gave their opinions. And Stoneham's opinion was, if this happens, then they'll burn down the Polo Grounds. Because I think he was afraid that, it was an African-American neighborhood, and for some reason, African-American people would hate this move. But part of it too is that a lot of the owners were under the impression that they were doing the Negro Leagues a favor by remaining segregated. And so there was, I think, a lot of groupthink in that. And there was one guy who definitely was not part of the groupthink, and that was Bill Veeck. And my guess is that if the Dodgers didn't do it, then Veeck would have done it eventually.
I agree completely, and he's my favorite renegade, and I think his son was my second favorite renegade. If these guys and gals have not read Veeck is in Rec, they need to read it. It is one of the all-time great reads in baseball.
Yeah, and I think we miss him. I think we miss having a fly on the wall with these owners now, which is really a shame, because I'd love to know what's really going on with the way these guys think.
Yeah.
Thank
you
Bill.
very much.
Howard, you're up.
Thanks. How you doing, Andrew?
I'm doing great.
Great. Good to hear that. I enjoy what you're talking about. I grew up in New York, but I was only 5 when the Giants and Dodgers went west. My earliest memories of the 62 season, not only because the Mets were born, but because of that playoff. And the Giants, I remember, caught the Dodgers on the very last day. And I still remember the last out of Game 3 when Willie caught the ball and just rammed it into the right field stands. But if it wasn't the Dodgers, it was the Cardinals beat them. And then in the 70s, 71, Pirates beat them. The Giants couldn't get over the hump. And because the Giants and the Dodgers were not on TV much, even nationally, I think NBC had the game of the week Saturday afternoon. And I was too busy playing with my friends outside to watch any possible Giant-Dodger games. But I still felt the rivalry somewhat, like Gary from 3,000 miles away. But it wasn't until 2013, when I was 60 years old, that I fulfilled one thing's on my bucket list, and that was I saw a Giant-Dodger game. Finally, I had seen the Giants play the Mets. I had seen the Dodgers play the Mets. Never the Giants against the Dodgers until 2013, and that was an odd year, right? That was one of the years the Giants were going downhill, and it was we were, really kind of sad about that, but we happened to be in California on vacation, and the Dodgers were in town. We went, and I really felt the rivalry reborn in me that day, because first of all, I finally saw the Dodgers against the Giants, but we were also surrounded in our section by Dodger fans. Some of them were really obnoxious. One guy, the guy in front of us, I remember he was a Latino guy, he had a Los Dodgers shirt. And whenever the Giants struck out, Los Giants, I mean, the guy was really obnoxious. But we had the last laugh because the Giants won that game. I think it was 4-2. And it was the only game of the 3-game series that they won. So I put up with the obnoxiousness of the Dodger fans. To me, it was a thrill. It wasn't the Polo Grounds. It wasn't Ebbets. It was AT&T Park at the time. And it was just a thrill to finally, fulfill a dream to see a Giants Dodger game. Of course, I have the ticket stubs still. And those days, they were still giving out ticket stubs. Now, you
That's
take out the
right.
phone and,
Now you have to hold up your cell phone and say, see, I went to that game.
Oh, I mean, I was just at Citi Field last week for opening game, and I'm trying to figure it out, and people are yelling, do this, press this, blah, blah, blah. I did experience, though, when the Giants won in 10, 12, and 14, it was a very good feeling again. And I really topped it off by being at that game in 2013, despite the fact that it was a down year. One final note about 2013, that was the year, I think the first year that the Giants stepped foot back into Yankee Stadium in September for a regular season game. And as much as I grew up hating the Yankees, and by the way, my first 10 years of life was 6 blocks from Yankee Stadium. I grew up in the Bronx. But the game was a letdown because the Giants were hopelessly out of it by that time. I was surrounded by Yankee fans. And to tell you the truth, it really kind of sucked. The subway, the D train, taking the D train and switching off. We once went to a Yankee Met Mayor's Trophy game exhibition. Our car was stolen during the game. That was in the mid-'60s. So I don't have many good memories of Yankee Stadium, but at least I saw the Giants there for the first time since '62. But the rivalry to me, it's now I hate the Dodgers again. They got the Japanese superstars and everything else. But I watch them when I can when they're on late night, if I don't have work the next day or whatever. And I hope it continues. I think it's good for baseball to have those two teams because of their long history still going at it. But it'll never be the same as it was in Brooklyn and New York and in the '60s, New York and San Francisco and LA. It just won't be the same. But I enjoyed your talk tonight. I enjoyed your talk. And my father was a big Giant fan, and he, may rest in peace, hated the Dodgers, let me tell you. And his favorite Giant was Mel Ott. Love Mel Ott.
There you go.
Thank you, Howard. Dave Lippman,
you.
you're up.
Okay, thank you very much, Lee. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Good. Okay, that was a tremendous talk. If my father and grandfather were around, they'd have enjoyed hearing about Leo DeRocher's move because they remembered it with utter clarity. It was a shock to their system. I have 2 questions. First, of the events that you describe in the book, which was your favorite? I see you did your research. The second is, with the Giants winning those 3 World Series in the last decade and the Dodgers becoming a powerhouse in this decade, is there going to be any chance of a revised and expanded edition?
I'll answer your second question first. It doesn't seem very likely. I haven't heard anything from McFarland, and they would have to want to do it. I think they're an interesting publisher. I mean, I don't know if any of you have had experience with them.
Yeah, they shot my book idea down.
Yeah, they're it's funny. They have
Family in New York baseball. They said I write well, but no, they're not going to do it.
yeah.
Excellent.
What they're looking for is, they're looking for kind of like they want to make money on every book they sell. So they don't invest a lot into it. I was lucky to have an editor who was passionate about the rivalry, and who did it for just a small share of the royalties. But they don't edit, they just figure if we can find a topic that will sell 200 copies or 500 copies, then we're good. And that was basically the way they felt about this book. although we exceeded those expectations, and they did actually invite me to write another book later, which was a nerd book for me and didn't sell because they gave it a bad title, but that's another story. And so they haven't talked to me since then. And so I don't think there's any chance for a revision. And what was your first question again?
What was your favorite incidents in the book? I mean, you got all
Hmm.
kinds of drama and comedy in there, so I'm just wondering what story, researching it and writing about it, was the most fun.
Okay, so this is like what a nerd I am. And so it's probably not a great story to tell, but you remember the phrase that Charlie Dressen uttered, "The Giants is dead"?
Yeah, sure.
Almost every book you see will tell you that that was something he said when the Dodgers were 13 and a half games ahead of the Giants in 1951. And it didn't happen that way. And I knew it didn't happen that way, but I didn't know when Dressen actually said it. And so I was in 5 different, I was in the San Francisco Public Library, the LA Public Library, the New York Public Library, the Brooklyn Public Library, and the Hall of Fame Library researching this. And I finally pinned it down. It was I believe August 8th, 1953, when Dressen actually said that. He didn't say it in 1951. And the Giants truly was dead in 1953. They didn't have a chance against those Dodgers. So just doing that research and finding the real story there, I did a review of a couple of books about Willie Mays for Sabre back in 2010. And even the guy who wrote the authorized biography of Willie got that wrong. And so like the nerd in me was like really, really happy to have figured out that that one little micro event, which nonetheless we all remember, what the truth behind it actually was.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Mr. Met, Greg Prince.
Hey, thanks, Gary. Andrew, thank you so much for the presentation as well as the book, which I've enjoyed.
Thank you.
One part of it, I really got a kick out of the way you set up every section, sort of a thumbnail sketch of each era. And within there, you had a heading, "Wore both uniforms but shouldn't have," which I thought was a great way of looking at the Giant-Dodger relationship. I mean, you talked about DeRocher earlier, you talked about Magley, I mean, guys who actually contributed to great things for both franchises. In that realm, who stands out for you on both sides, whether it's personally or just as the author and historian? Do you just shake your head and say, I can't believe he was a Dodger, I can't believe he was a Giant?
Yeah, so I think there were probably 2 pictures who motivated me to add that section. The first was Juan Marichal, because I mean, the idea of Marichal pitching for the Dodgers, I know he wanted to stay in the major leagues, but it just struck me as like, that is just so wrong. And then when Orel Hershiser came to the Giants, and again, I just thought, I mean, me personally, as a Giant fan, was like, that's just so wrong. I mean, I know he's helping us, but like, that's just so wrong.
One that strikes me, I didn't see him play, but I'm certainly familiar with him, is Duke Snider, who
Yeah,
I guess was who you had listed in there, who had hung on for 1 year with the Mets, and you know, have bat will travel, I suppose.
yeah,
But
exactly.
but then again, Duke Snider had a Duke Snider night in the Polo Grounds in
Yeah.
1963, which I'm sure nobody would have imagined 5 years earlier. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does anybody have a question? Renee, you are up.
Thank you for this. I really enjoyed this a lot. I enjoy all our meetings, but this one really got me. I mean, your capturing of the rivalry, your little stories of how things came about for Brooklyn and for the Giants. I'm going to buy your book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm buying the book.
Anybody else? Anybody else? By the way, yesterday would have been the unfortunate anniversary of 60 years ago yesterday, the Polo Grounds the demolition of it had begun. We're gonna go to Patrick and then Ed Freer. Patrick Henry, you are up. Patrick, you gotta unmute. There you
Thank
go.
you. Andrew, thank you so much. I was 7 years old in 1947 when Jackie Robinson joined the Dodgers. So from 7 to 17, I was a passionate Dodger fan. I can't imagine the rivalry was ever as great during any stretch. Tell me the truth.
I think that the rivalry was just as good after they came to California. I think there's a certain fondness for that era because it was the end in a lot of ways, and it was the end of a lot of things. I mean, the Brooklyn Eagle was in trouble, and the whole borough was in trouble economically, and so it was. I think there was a sense of of like impending doom and stuff that adds an aura to the Dodgers, as because it was mainly the Dodgers, I think, who drove the memories of that era, and they were a remarkable team. They were incredible. I mean, when you think of the continuity that the Dodgers brought, basically bringing back the same cast of characters every year, some of whom, like Gil Hodges, who lived in Brooklyn, married people from Brooklyn, were part of the community. It was such a devastating loss to Brooklyn. With the Giants, I think it was a little bit different. The Giants were able to make more of a case that they needed to move. Certainly when Emmanuel Seller, who was the congressman from Brooklyn, who held congressional hearings about the two teams moving, asked for their financial sheets. It was one of the few glimpses we've ever gotten of the major league team's profit and loss statements. It was very clear that the Dodgers were second only to the Yankees in profitability. They didn't really need to leave Brooklyn. If they had stuck around for a few more years, Moses would have built Shea Stadium for them out in Queens. They'd have become the Queens Dodgers or whatever they wanted to call themselves. And they would basically be where the Mets are today, which is not too bad. The Giants, on the other hand, they were a much more middling franchise. And a lot of that was due to Stoneham's ineptitude, but they nonetheless presented a better case. And when those teams came out to the West Coast, again, the fans, Californians are different from New Yorkers. Californians tend to be a little bit cooler on the exterior, and they're not quite as intense in a lot of ways, but they are intense inside. And I think that they felt the rivalry, and they showed that by how they turned out for games. I did a statistical analysis of how many people attended just regular home games for the two teams, and then how many came out for the rivalry. And almost every year from the time that the Giants and Dodgers moved west till about the 70s, there was a clear difference. I mean, it was a huge difference in the number of people who turned out to see the rivalry. So it was alive and really powerful out here. Although, again, I think if you feel that sense of loss, if you're from the East Coast and you feel that sense of loss, you feel like nothing can rival that, and nothing can, because the two teams are still here. We'll feel it when they pull an Oakland A's on us, which hopefully is not for a very long time.
Yeah, we experienced during that time, the only time in baseball history where two teams were in the same city and in the same league. So you had 22 games a year. I mean, it was fierce rivalry.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for your good response.
Patrick, thanks for showing up tonight.
Thank you, Gary.
Good to see you. Ed, why don't you wrap it up?
Yeah, just what I wanted to mention was it was fascinating, that early conversation about Lorraine Day and Leo DeRocher, because it brought me back to memories, because you're talking about different eras. In the 50s and 60s, there was a great shock in New York when Rockefeller was going to marry a divorcee. And this made all the headlines of all the New York papers, and it was just like a big scandal. Today, it wouldn't matter anything. So, again, you just touched on it, and I just wanted to bring it back with that fight with sending Leo off and Branch Rickey, the divorce there. if Ricky had gained more control, would that have helped anything with the Giants from what you see staying in New York?
You know,
But-
I'm not entirely sure. I don't know that Ricky would have been inclined to move. Ricky had, I think he had realized a lot of his ambitions. He was an older man than O'Malley. And he had contributed an enormous amount to the game. I mean, he had basically set up farm systems. He was the first person to conceive of farm systems as feeders to the major league team. You know, he had made a lot of contributions to the game. I don't know that it would have occurred to him when the Dodgers were the second most profitable team in all of Major League Baseball to move to Los Angeles. I think he would have dealt with all of the issues that were presented in Brooklyn with the old stadium and everything else, probably in a more constructive way with Moses, even though he was a hard guy to deal with, and they would have eventually worked out some kind of stadium deal, some kind of tide over between the closing down of Ebbets Field and the birth of Shea Stadium. I think it would have worked out a little bit more, but again, that's all conjecture. I think
Conjecture.
somebody had mentioned earlier about hypotheticals. That's
Yeah,
a tough one, but I think that Ricky would not have had that ambition.
Yeah, I never thought of Ricky as a potential savior of the Giants, but somehow a Ricky Payson, Virginia Payson coalition, maybe
Yeah.
something could have happened.
Yeah, and they did work together for a while. And I don't know that, you know, there was talk about the Giants moving to Minneapolis.
Yes.
You know, because the Giants weren't doing as well as the Dodgers. But again, I don't know how actively Stoneham would have pursued that option without the encouragement that he received from O'Malley to move. Because O'Malley was definitely, I mean, Stoneham had more reason to move, but O'Malley was the person kind of driving this. And O'Malley knew that if he went just by himself, the rest of the league would probably vote the move down. But if you could send two teams out there so that the road games, you know, and the travel expenses could be amortized a little bit better, then he had a much better chance of getting approval to take over the LA market.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Andrew, again, great book. Giants, Dodgers, 4 cities, 2 teams, 1 rivalry. And I'll echo what Dave Lippman said. It's a shame that you can't continue because based on your research tonight, it was fabulous. And it's a shame we can't go, you know, from the new stadium until the present day, because I'm sure you have a lot of great stuff in there. Please do not be a stranger. Hop on
Thank you.
board anytime any of these topics interest you. Let's all give it up for Andrew Goldblatt.
Thank you, everyone.
Drew,
Have
thank
a
you.
great night. We'll see everybody next Thursday. And I'll hang around here if anybody wants to talk a little baseball. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.